I did learn the hard way that if you go more than 20 miles an hour, and if you are trying to go uphill at the same time, that you can have a meeting with the pavement. And so as long as you're not pushing the board past its limits, I have found it to be pretty fun, relatively safe exercise to be involved in. It takes a little getting used to. The motor and the speed at which the motor turns is the only thing keeping you upright. And so a common occurrence whenever people do push the board past its limits is to end up in what's aptly named a nosedive. And that's exactly what happened to me the other day when I was going 20.2 miles an hour uphill and just trying to push it. It was, I think it was the second day that I had the OneWheel, and I was just incredibly comfortable on it and enjoyed it. I mean, I obviously wasn't as good as people who've been riding for a long time, but I think since I grew up skiing and had a skateboard when I was a kid and generally like to do things that are athletic and those kind of things, I was too comfortable too quick. There are a few rules to try to keep you as safe as possible. The first is to keep it under the speed limit. Future Motion recommends not going more than about 15 miles an hour. It will begin to give you that pushback sensation, so you know, hey, I shouldn't go too much faster. But it can be kind of subtle, and especially if you're not really kind of balanced over the center of the board, you might not notice it, or you might just push through it, and all of a sudden it's real easy to go from 15 to 20 miles an hour on this board, because it's an electric motor, it's got a pretty good amount of torque, and will just take off. And so that's what happened to me. I was going uphill, and the app tells me that my max speed was 20.2 miles an hour, and I know that was my max speed because I went from 20.2 to 0 in about half a second. And thankfully I was wearing my helmet. The side of my head kissed the pavement. At 20 miles an hour, that could be a pretty bad prospect. There are some things like don't push the board past its speed limit, so keep it around 15 miles an hour. The board isn't going to shut off based on your speed, it's going to shut off based on the fact that you're drawing too many amps and the motor just can't keep up. So if you're going downhill, obviously you can go more than 20, but the physical limitations of the board are about 20 miles an hour. So keep it around 15 and you'll be all right. I mean, you don't have to worry about that. So when you sense the pushback, slow down. They also say to try to keep your center of gravity over the wheel, like in the middle of the board. Although, now I'm not an engineer, but I don't think that's actually physically possible. They just don't want you to lean out too much over the front of the board. But obviously the way that you make the board go forward is that you shift your weight to the front of the board and then it goes forward. And so you can't keep your weight over the center of the board and shift your weight to the front of the board at the same time. But I think I know what they're saying. What you need to do is bend your knees, and I think just make sure that your back knee is bent more than your front knee. And I also think it's a good idea to make sure that there's enough bend in your front knee that if your board were to go to the ground, you would have enough slack in your leg to be able to put your leg all the way down to the ground. Because that nosedive is when the front of your board comes in contact with the ground. And sometimes when I get started out, maybe I'll do it here in just a little bit, I'll do some nosedive practice, or from a stop, I'll start out and push the front of my board. Now the board compensates really quick and pulls me back up, so I can do it for a second or two. But just to be able to feel what that's like, for the front of the board to come in contact with the ground, I think is good, because then you kind of build that muscle memory. God forbid if that were to happen while I'm going 15 miles an hour or something like that, maybe I'd be able to recover quicker, because it just took me totally by surprise on my second day of riding. And I think it's always going to take you by surprise, but if you get enough practice in, maybe you can mitigate those effects. I've also gotten some fangs from Land Surf, which is a company that makes little wheels that can go on the front of your OneWheel, which is kind of cool. That's part of the fun. I mean, I totally bought it just back here. Actually, it was right behind me on this street here. It's not a video game, and that's what we like about it. So I keep it around 15 miles an hour, or at least that's my goal, and then if I'm a couple miles over, no big whoop. You try to keep your weight as far back as possible over the center of the board, but like I said, I mean, the physics just is, if you're gonna shift your weight forward in order to go forward, you have to shift your weight forward to go forward. You just don't want to do that to the extreme, and so basically, don't take off really quick, otherwise you end up doing that nosedive practice. So you might be doing that on purpose just to see where the limits of the board are. When you charge up your board, if your first part of your ride is in any way going to be downhill, be real careful about that. And so just charge your board to 95%, not 100%, so that if it does some of that regenerative braking, as it does that regen, it won't bring the battery to 99 or 100%. And I find that's a bigger problem, are people who slow down to help you. You know, like they don't want to run over you, which I appreciate, but then they slow down, like if the speed limit's 45 on the road, they slow down and drive by at like 20 miles an hour, and it completely throws you off, because the slower you go, the more difficult it is. And so somebody like riding in your blind spot, going 20 miles an hour, is a far bigger danger than someone who just passes you at 40 miles an hour. If you don't overcharge your board, or if you're careful to not go downhill whenever your board is charged to 100%, if you try to accelerate slowly and evenly, and thus keeping your weight over the center of the board as much as possible, even though that's not really fully possible to continue to go forward. If you keep your speed down, if you pay careful attention when you're going uphill, you can be careful. You know, always wear your safety equipment, especially the helmet. I think that's the most important thing, because your brain is pretty important. But next important is probably wrist guards, and I would say wrist guard on your leading arm. I've always gone with my right hand and my right foot forward, but that is apparently opposite of what most right-handed people do, but you know, to each his own. That's kind of just the way it goes. My impressions of the OneWheel are, it is a blast, it is fun, it's relatively safe, but you got to be careful. A couple weeks in, I love it, it's awesome. I would say there is a real thing that the longer you ride initially, the longer your rides are, you experience what's called foot fatigue. Your back foot cramps up, or I don't know, gets sore. I guess the muscles are stretching and those kind of things. And I have found that if you really carve some turns, like backside turns like that, where you're turning towards your back, and if you really press down on your heel and relax the balls of your feet while you do that, it kind of lets some blood, I guess, get back down in your foot, and that helps a ton. You're gonna fall, especially in the beginning. You're gonna have trouble getting on and off of it, and it's gonna flip over. You're gonna hit curbs. You're gonna, just like if you're riding a skateboard. So don't just jump on and take off going 15 miles an hour. I'd say keep it around 5 to 10 until you get really comfortable with it. But it's a blast. So I mean, I'd recommend it to anyone who has the means to get one. I highly recommend you pick one up, and it's a fun thing. So I hope that you've enjoyed my half hour of ramblings, and if you're still watching this, I guess you have. it.